Welcome to Small Talk by Sfarim Chatter. I'm Nachi Weinstein. On this episode of Small Talk, I'm going to be joined by Rabbi Dovid Bogopulsky, who is the author of the newly published 2 volumes, Timely and Timeless, Parsha Insights for Rabbi Yehoshua Weinfeld, and his editor, Rabbi Yehoshua Duker, and we will be discussing this new volume. So thank you both for joining me. So let's start off, Rabbi Dovid, I'll put it straight to you, and let's start off. What can you tell the listeners about this book?
First of all, thank you for having us. It's my first time on a podcast. Very exciting. The book Timely and Timeless, which came into existence after a long, long time of working on it, is really, on the surface, it appears to be like cute farts on a parsha from a not so well known rabbi, but it's far beyond that. The special part of the Sefer really is because of who created the Torah, who is the one. It's his insights. It's all Rabbi Weinfeld. Yehoshua Weinfeld is an individual who has. Not that I know so many Talmidei Chachamim, but he is definitely a person who is unique in the sense that his insights are extremely refreshing. His perspectives are unique that you don't hear out of your average person with a big, long white beard. Not that they're controversial, they're creative and they're different. And after hearing them for a few years, I wrote them up, I decided that it would be beneficial to people that don't know him, that they could get to know him and they could hear what he has to say and how, in as much as it impacted my life, I assume that I hope that it would impact other people's lives.
So you'll give some examples, both of you, as we go on this episode. Yeah. But at least if you could tell listeners, as you said, he's not so well known. So what his basic background is, and where does he live, like for those that aren't familiar with him at all.
So I'll say a little bit as much as I know. Rabbi Duker, who's a real Talmud from when he had the Yeshiva Lev Avram, will tell us more. For what I know about him, happens to be he came to Boca Raton where I live once, and we were driving to Hollywood because he was going to give a shiur in Hollywood. And I just said, tell it to me from the beginning. What year were you born? Where were you born? So he starts telling me 1965, Muncie, this, that. So just jumping a little bit. From what I know, he was a Rebbe in Teres Moshe for 7 years. And then he started his own yeshiva in 1993, and he had it for until 2001. And then he had a kollel in Ramat Eshkol for many, many years, and he has a shul. And I have to admit, it's not like the most popular amongst the younger light in Ramat Eshkol. It's a certain flavor and style that you have to come to appreciate. Even myself, I moved there in 2014. I did not step foot in the shul till 2018. And he would always say, can you imagine if we knew each other for another 4 years? But it is what it is. Whatever it is, we know each other from the time that we do. So he's a Rosh Kollel in Ramat Eshkol. He has a shul. And he would darshan after Kiddush. And I wrote it down. But Rabbi Duker, I would really hand it off to you to really give much more about Rabbi Weinfeld.
Okay. First of all, thank you as well for hosting us. I'm a little bit hesitant to speak about him, because I'll say a person is not Omed al Das Rabo, doesn't fully appreciate his Rebbe until after 40 years have passed, and I became a Talmud Rabbi Weinfeld only 32 years ago, so I'm not there yet. It is important to understand, I think, his background, because understanding the background, I think, will help also set the stage for appreciating the uniqueness of the Sefer, which is Rabbi Weinfeld. If you want to talk about Rabbi Weinfeld, you have to start with his family, his parents. His father was Rabbi Avram Weinfeld. Rabbi Avram Weinfeld was a tremendous Talmud Chacham. He was born in Europe, survived the Holocaust, was in Auschwitz as a teenager, ended up in America after the war, and he would be much more well known than he is, if not for the fact that unfortunately he passed away at a relatively young age of I think maybe 57 or so. He ended up moving to Muncie, and he was a Rev in Muncie before Muncie was Muncie. Let's put it that way. And he had a small shul, I think, in his home. He was the author of a Sefer of Shalos Teshuvos called Lev Avram, as well as several other Svarim. He was Hasidish in background. I don't think he was a Chassid of any particular Hasidus, which also is something which is very important about Rabbi Weinfeld as well, which is an independent mind. Meaning, I know that The Lev Avram, his father, had a very close relationship with the Satmar Rebbe, and he had a very close relationship with the Kloisenberger Rebbe, even though Satmar and Kloisenberg, were not exactly on the same page, but that didn't matter. He was independent, and he took what he took for the good from wherever he could take it from. So Rabbi Weinfeld grew up, I'm not going to say, I can't say anything, but from the impression I've had from him is that the biggest mashpia on his Avodas Hashem was his father. He learned in America in Beis HaTalmud. He was a very close Talmud of Rav Shaul Brus over there. Then he came to Eretz Yisrael. He learned by Rebbe Soloveitchik, very close to Rebbe Soloveitchik. Then he was in Lakewood by Reb Shner Cutler. And then after he got married, he ended back in Eretz Yisrael. He was a Rebbe in Taras Moshe, as Reb Dovid said. Then he opened his yeshiva, Lev Avram, named after his father. I was zocheh to be of the inaugural group of Bachram that went there, and I was there from day one until the yeshiva sadly closed 7 years later. I was there 4 years as a buffer, 3 years in the kollel, and I was able to, learn a lot from Rabbi Weinfeld during those years. And then Baruch Hashem, I live in Eretz Yisrael. I've had this chus to remain close connection with him from then until now. So just to bring things up back to the Sefer. When Reb Dovid used to send out PDFs of what he wrote up from the Kiddush after Shabbos, and he'd send that out as a PDF. And at one point he said, I'm going to be moving to America. I'm thinking about maybe trying to turn this into a book. If anybody has any ideas, let me know. So I contacted him. We had never met. I contacted him privately, and from there, the idea of turning it into a real proper sefer was that idea was born then.
This was said over, as you said, Dovid, at Shabbos, at the Kiddush, and after Shabbos, you would remember what was said and you would transcribe it. Is that how this worked? And then eventually you would send us parsha sheets, and then Rabbi Yehoshua got involved. Because it's not like your regular sefer, a little different then.
Yeah, so I'll tell you, Rabbi Weinfeld, after davening, he sits down in his chotzer, courtyard outside the shul, and he makes Kiddush, and then he immediately starts talking. And sometimes they're longer marachas, some of them are cute farts, some are things that he heard, some are original. And there was, before I came along, there was someone that was writing it, but in a much more, he has a very unique way of speaking, Rabbi Weinfeld. He has a certain personality, certain ways of saying things, and the person who wrote it down would write it down exactly as if it's coming out of his mouth, it helped for getting the experience, but it was a little less professional in the sense that it wasn't really ready to be printed. After davening the shul for a few months and that original writer moving back to America, so in the middle of the Kiddush, I was sitting in the back eating herring, and he says to me, Bogopulsky, maybe you could write down what I say. So I was very nervous. It's not so easy. So I said, I'll try. So after davening, basically, I would go home and I would put napkins in all the various farm that I would remember. And then I would be very anxious the entire Shabbos afternoon. I would ask everyone that I saw, different people in the shul, I would go over it quickly by mincha time. And then I would ask him, and then he would be like, no, you missed it. And then I would write it up to the best of my ability every Motzei Shabbos for 3 years. Credit to my wife that she allowed me to do this. We never went out Motzei Shabbos for 3 years. And sometimes I would write it up before Havdalah. I was so cuckoo to get it on paper. And then I would send it to him Motzei Shabbos. And then we would speak on the phone Sunday night. He would read it. He would go through it. He would add, subtract. I would record the phone call. And then I would go over it on Monday, edit the document, send it back to him. He would approve. And then I would send it out to current Talmidim, previous Talmidim, and things like that. And that's what I did for 3 years. And then it evolved. And then he started giving a shiur. And then we made a website and a podcast. And everything gradually evolved with my obsession, so to speak.
Pretty amazing, very unique way of putting together a book, or say for 2 volumes here. So for both of you, and you could each speak to this separately, is the style of the sefer. You mentioned Rabbi Weinfeld's unique way of speaking. He's a unique thinker, he's an independent thinker. He's not your typical per se. So if you can give some examples so listeners can understand what they can expect from the sefer.
So I happens to be Rabbi Duker. I would categorize, I'm sure there's other ways to categorize his styles. There's 2 things that I think me and you are both going to try to highlight. Is a lot of times what he'll do is he'll start out with a lumdish shtickle, and then he has this unique way to blend it and segue into a more machshava idea within the same inyan. It's like a lot of his own sefer, Merkeves Yecheskel, where he'll start with a lumdish shtickle on the sugya that's related to whatever he's discussing, and then he'll say something like Le'inyan tikkun adeis v'yishur hamaisim, which is like his key words for how he's going to now, how is this going to like relate to my avodas Hashem? Like, what am I going to take out of this? So a lot of the stuff that he has, that's one thing he does. I would say another way is that he a lot of times has like one theme, like there's one idea, and he sees a lot of different parts in the parsha through that lens. So I want to give an example of the second one, where I recently found that, and I know it's appreciated because I have the opportunity as an assistant rabbi in Boca. I speak to a lot. I give the drasha a lot of times. So a bunch of weeks ago, in Parshas Mitzorah, so Rabbi Weinfeld has an idea that specifically by the Mitzorah, when he comes to the Kayin, he has to say kinega nearly babayis, right? He can't say I have a nega, even if he's a Talmud Chacham. Rashi says. So the Taisus Yontif is discussing why that is. So he says it's one of the reasons is because of what Rashi says, that Lama l'shoyn chalemer any idea. A person should teach himself to say I don't know. So usually, even though that's a midas chasidus, he says here it sounds pretty me'ikra din, like you have to do that. Why? So he basically says because the pitfall of the Baal Lashon Hara, his shortcoming is that not in as much as what he said, but it's that he saw something when he saw an individual do something, and he judged. He was machlit. He judged. So part of his rehabilitation, so to speak, is that he has to say, I'm not sure what I'm looking at. Don't be so sure when you see something. You think you have a tsaras, you're not sure. You have to train yourself to say, when I see something, I'm not sure. That's like the theme that's what he says. And he'll in every year he spoke on that parsha, that idea came out in 4 different parts. He would say it in describing why, in a cutesy way, why they were different shades, different colors. Not everything looks the same. And he would also say, that which, when you break down the walls, the Amorim hid in the Matmonius in the walls. So what you see on the surface, if you just look a little further, like you see on the outside something that looks ugly, but if you look a little further, beneath the surface is something very beautiful. So it's the same idea. It's the issue of the Baal Lashon Hara and how you see how he's supposed to get better. And it is different. That outlook and that perspective on the parsha, how it finds itself in different areas of that parsha, I think that's something unique. I think that I've seen him do that a lot, and that's something that I personally gains from. And that style appears a lot in the Sefer.
Okay, I'll take from here the idea that Dovid mentioned before about starting with a halachic concept and then segueing into Haggadah, into something practical. I just see in Parshas Bahaloscha, he quotes the mitzvah of the Chatzotzros, and then he quotes the Rambam in Sefer HaMitzvahs, where the Rambam says that there's a mitzvah to blow the Chatzotzros in the Mikdash by the karbanos of the Yamim Tovim, and also to blow the Chatzotzros when there's a time of tzara, a time of distress. And he cites the question from the Maggid Mishnah, which is, this is very odd that the Rambam counts both of these as under one mitzvah in the Sefer HaMitzvahs, being that these are two actions performed at totally different times, totally different circumstances, for totally different reasons. So why is this viewed as one mitzvah? So using this question as a springboard, he develops a theme based on the Chizkuni and the Ibn Ezra, that they're really intertwined, that the schus that we have at the time of the Melchama, that the Chatzotzros should serve as a merit in the time of war, is only because of the fact that we also blew the very same Chatzotzros during the Avoda. And that from there, he just takes it to a very practical, eye-opening perspective, which is that we usually think that the tefillos, the davening that we do in a time of tzara, that's really the powerful tefillos that have very deep emotional impact on us, and those are really those are the ones that really have the biggest influence in Shamayim. But here we see that the merit of the Chatzotzros in the time of war really comes from the Chatzotzros that we did in the times of joy. That people have a tendency in times of difficult times to turn to Hashem, but in terms of times of joy, when everything is good, we leave well enough alone, and we don't remember always to remember Hashem in the time of joy as well. And putting these two mitzvahs together, these two different belongings of the Chatzotzros together, the Rambam is giving us this idea that no, you'll only be able to turn to Hashem in the time of tzara if you first built up that relationship in the times of simcha. That's an example of the other idea. One thing there about Bogopulsky did not say, which I think is also very crucial, strewn throughout the Sefer are things that you can't get anywhere else. Yeah, Rabbi Weinfeld, for whatever reason, had his chus wherever he was. He was close to the Gedolim, the Rabbanim, the Rosh Yeshivas, wherever he was, and he has a lot of Torah Shabbal Peh. I just want to give an example. He has a story over here of Rebbe Soloveitchik, where he tells the story that he was standing together with Rebbe Soloveitchik on the porch on Rehov Press, where Yeshiva's brisk is now. Now the porch is a different porch than it was back then. It was the day of a Shefer Brachos of Rebbe Soloveitchik. So he tells the following story, that he was there, they were talking on the porch, and there was a car going around the loudspeaker, as anybody who's been in Yerushalayim is familiar with. It was announcing Hespedim. Who are the Hespedim for? That's Hespedim for the Satmar Rebbe. Rabbi Yoel Teitelbaum had died. And the car was going around announcing that they're going to be Hespedim at the building of the Eda Charedis, down on Rehov Strauss. Rebbe said to him, to Rabbi Weinfeld, he said, that's very strange. I hadn't even heard yet that the Satmar Rebbe was nifter. And they haven't even had the Levaya yet in America. So why is a car going around announcing that they're having a Hespedim already here in Zupnik, at the Ada building? Well, that's very unusual. And he said, Rebbe sat for a minute, and then he said, I think I understand what's happening. He says, the Satmar Rav, in addition to being the Satmar Rav, he was also the Dovid of the Eda Charedis. And he said, Mistama, probably the Eda Charedis is afraid that at the Levaya in America, when they announce that the Satmar Rebbe's nephew is taking over as Satmar Rebbe, they're also going to say, and taking over the Satmar Rav's position as the Dovid of the Eda Charedis. So the Eda Charedis here wants to quickly go and have his Hespedim for the Satmar Rebbe here in Yerushalayim before the funeral in America. And then at the funeral, at the Hespedim that they have here, they'll announce on their own who the next Dovid is going to be. And that way they'll avoid getting into the situation of being preempted by the Satmar Hasidim in America. And that's what he said to Rabbi Weinfeld after he thought for a minute. The Kachava at the Hespedim in Yerushalayim, they announced that the Minchas Yitzchak was to be the next guy. But in the Sefer, this comes up in the context of how Talmidei Chachamim have a vision. They have foresight. They're able to be able to see things with a deeper perspective than most people are. That was an example that he gave. But there are many other stories like this, not exactly like that, but stories along these lines, personal interactions he had. And one thing I'll add also is that it's not consistent, but after a lot of the parshios, instead of the Kiddush, instead of talking only about the parsha, if there was somebody who was nifter that week, a yahrzeit that week, he'd speak about the person whose yahrzeit it was. So some of them are classic Gedolim, the Rambam, the Ravid, but also some, people that are not as well known, like Reb Shaul Brutz. I mentioned that, one week he spoke about him. He's, told over something very interesting. He said about the Reb Baruch Ber writing the Birkas Shmuel, his style in writing it. He writes about Reb Chaim Yitzchak Kaplan, but many other of the Rabbanim that he had a personal connection with. So things that he heard from them or stories that he heard from them are present over the course of the Sefer as well.
Fascinating, very interesting. So you'll get some interesting Torah and some interesting, as you said, Torah Shabbal Peh stories of what Rabbi Weinfeld heard. Now, Rabbi Yehoshua, I want to ask you another thing, which is, we heard about Dovid's editing process with his napkins and his transcriptions. And saying, what was your process involvement with this farm?
Right. Well, my process was this. I reached out to Rabbi Bogopulsky because I've done editing on English Sfarim in the past, in the present as well. And I'm also very familiar with Rabbi Weinfeld's style of Torah. I don't live in Ramat Eshkol. I wasn't at those Kiddushim, but his style I'm familiar with. So I thought that I would be a good person to try to take it, because when Rabbi Bogopulsky did it, it was, it was written in English, but with the Hebrew phrases and the quotes from the Hebrew sources mixed in and not translated. And we realized in order to appeal to a broad audience, we really have to have the entire text of the Sefer be readable in English. So I got the raw files, the raw transcriptions from Rabbi Bogopulsky. I would rewrite them in what I hoped was proper, good English, understandable, at the same time trying as much as possible, but it's really impossible, but trying to do what I could to maintain the original voice of the speaker. Rabbi Weinfeld always says, the Pasuk Dilm says, "Ein Omer ve'ein Dvarim bli nishma kolam." He says there's always an Omer and there's always the Dvarim. He says if you don't have, you can have a good Omer is a good speaker, and good Dvarim is the content is good. He says if it's Ein Omer and Ein Dvarim, if there's not a good speaker and there's not good content, then bli nishma kolam. Nobody's going to listen. But I knew that the Dvarim was gold that I knew, and I tried as much as I could to maintain the tone or a little bit of an echo of the tone of the Omer. I would write it up, send it to Rabbi Weinfeld, because he, in terms of his presenting his own Torah, he is, I'll say a perfectionist, but he has strong opinions how it should be presented. I had a phone chavrusa every week to review exactly what I wrote. Again, corrections, additions, subtractions, worded this way, worded that way. And then, and then over the course of about maybe a year plus, we managed to get from Bereshis to Vizos HaBracha. And then from then on, we passed it on to the staff at Mosaic Press.
So he was involved to some extent. It's not just his Talmidim picking up the paper and running with it.
He was involved intimately, I would say, not just to some extent. Yeah.
He is very careful in general about how he's presented. He was very makbid. It should say selected Parsha Insights. People shouldn't think this is it. He has a ton of Torah written up, printed, published in Hebrew, in complex Ivrit, not found by your average American Rosh Hashiva. And he wanted everyone to know that this is a drop in the bucket of what he has to offer.
So in closing, for both of you, you can, Dovid, you can take this first, or sure, however you want to do it, is who would you say this, I would say book, but it's two volumes, but who would you say this book is meant for?
So when there was, originally when we were like Rabbi Duker just mentioned, we wanted it to be as accessible to as many people as possible. That's why part of the editing process was to really translate everything to the point where someone who's more affiliated with learning, you have to work backwards when you read it into English, like what is this referring to? Although everything is in the footnotes, but as in Boca for the past 2 years as a sister rabbi here, I take excerpts from my notes and I put it in the Weekly Insider for on the parsha, and I've had complaints a lot at times of too much Hebrew for the people that are unaffiliated and don't know, but they don't want to be robbed of the opportunity to learn and to appreciate and to understand what it's saying. So I started translating everything, even the simple words which you take for granted. We made it much more accessible, and then the feedback I started to get was extremely positive. People were able to relate to the timely messages, and it resonated with people very much. So but at the same point, it didn't compromise on the sophistication of the Torah, of the uniqueness of what he's offering, and it's a very unique way of communicating like lumdisha things and philosophical ideas, all within a user-friendly and understandable way that really everyone in the spectrum can benefit from.
Okay, if I could just add, well, instead of saying who I think it's for, I just want to share one more short thought from the Sefer, and then the listeners will get a greater sense of, is this the kind of thing that speaks to me? Yeah, it should just, this is very timely. It's now almost Erev Tisha B'Av. He quotes a Medrash Chazal that on the pasuk of Nachamu, Nachamu, Ami. It says, Chatu b'chiflayim, chet chata Yerushalayim, laku b'chiflayim, hilaksam yad Hashem kiflayim b'chol chatoseah, u'mitnachamim b'kiflayim, nachamu, nachamu, Ami. Meaning that they had a double chet, a double avera, a double sin. Their punishment was doubled, and the nachama is doubled. So he starts with a very simple question. I've heard of, more averos and fewer averos. I've heard of more severe averos and less severe averos. But what does it mean that their avera was doubled? Chet chata, chatu b'kiflayim. It was doubled. What's the idea of a doubled sin? So he develops the concept that whenever there's a chet, there are two things that happen. There's the actual avera in and of itself, which is one problem. And then there's the richuk, the distancing that the avera takes the person away from Hashem. And the chet chata is, first of all, Klal Yisrael did things that were wrong. And second of all, by doing so, they had a negative impact on the relationship with Hashem. That's the double chet. And in that sense, the double onesh, one onesh is for the chet itself, and one onesh is for the consequence brought about by the chet, by the sin of distancing from Hashem. But then the final thing that he says is that it's also the double nechama. The double nechama has to be, he says, we say, oh, we're waiting for the Beis HaMikdash. Are we really waiting for the Beis HaMikdash? If the Beis HaMikdash would pop up tomorrow, would we be ready for it? Would we be excited for it? We have a hard enough time sitting through a davening, for 2 hours on the Shabbos morning. So the nechama has to also be in two stages. The first stage of the nechama is going to be that renewing that sense of relationship with Hashem. And then after the nechama, that we have that relationship rebuilt, then we could have the ultimate nechama, that the Gula will come. So this is, again, an example of you took a medrash, novel, interpretation of the medrash, bringing the medrash down to a practical sense to our avoda. I think that whoever feels that such divrei Torah are inspiring for them will be able to find plenty more of the type in the Sefer.
Okay, well, thank you, Rabbi Shua and Dovid, for joining me. I'll link to the Sefer in the show notes. Again, a 2-volume set. At Mosaic Press, as always, Farm Chatter listeners can use code CHATTER, CHATTER, 15% off. So I'll link that in the show notes for those interested. And thank you both for joining me.